The sound of my mother's crystal wine glasses clinking against the mahogany table echoed through the sprawling dining room of our family estate in Willowbrook Heights. But beneath the polished surface, I could feel the familiar undercurrent of judgment that always seemed to follow me like a shadow. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting rippling shadows across the Persian rug that had been in the Blackwell family for 4 generations. It should have been a peaceful Sunday dinner, the kind of gathering that looked perfect from the outside, if I didn't already know this would be the last time I'd ever sit at this table as their daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Sophia Blackwell, 28 years old, and tonight I was about to discover just how little my own family actually valued me. But more importantly, they were about to discover just how much they'd underestimated the daughter they'd spent years dismissing as the family disappointment. My name is Sophia, but for most of my life, my family has called me the problem child, the one who doesn't quite fit, or my personal favorite from my mother, Isabella Blackwell, our ongoing project. You see, in the Blackwell family, success has always been measured by one thing: conformity to their vision of perfection. My older brother, Harrison, checked every box they'd ever dreamed of. Harvard Medical School graduate, chief resident at Northside Presbyterian Hospital, engaged to Charlotte Pemberton, a woman whose family pedigree could be traced back to the Mayflower. Harrison was everything they wanted in a child: prestigious, predictable, and most importantly, he never questioned their authority. Then there was me. While Harrison was collecting accolades and approval, I was collecting what my father, Richard Blackwell, called disappointing life choices. I'd graduated from State University instead of an Ivy League school. I worked in what they considered some computer thing instead of medicine or law. I lived in a modest apartment in downtown Millfield instead of the family estate. And worst of all, I had the audacity to think for myself instead of following the carefully laid path they'd designed for their children. For years, I'd tried to earn their respect through different means. I'd brought home promotion letters, awards from my company, even a feature article about my work in Tech Innovation Monthly. But somehow, none of it ever seemed to matter. Harrison's latest medical research paper would always overshadow my achievements. His engagement announcement would dominate family conversations while my career milestones were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. The truth was, I'd grown used to being the afterthought, the footnote in the Blackwell family success story. I'd learned to smile through the subtle comparisons, the pointed questions about when I'd settle down properly, and the way conversations would literally turn away from me whenever I tried to share something I was proud of. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was building my own life on my own terms. But tonight was different. Tonight, something had shifted in the family dynamic, and I could feel it in the way my mother kept glancing between Harrison and me, like she was comparing 2 investments and calculating which one would yield better returns. I could sense it in the way my father's jaw was set, that particular expression he wore when he was about to deliver what he considered tough love, but what usually felt more like a public execution of my character. The dinner itself was typical: Blackwell elegance, roasted duck with cherry reduction, organic vegetables from their private garden, wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But underneath the veneer of upper-class sophistication, there was something brewing. Harrison seemed unusually smug, wearing that particular smile he'd perfected since childhood, the one that appeared whenever he was about to be publicly praised at my expense. My mother, Isabella, kept shooting meaningful looks at my father. Those silent communications that long-married couples develop, the kind that excluded everyone else at the table. She'd spent the first 20 minutes of dinner talking about Harrison's latest achievement, something about a breakthrough in pediatric cardiology that had caught the attention of the medical board. I'd listened politely, offered genuine congratulations, and tried to ignore the way she glowed with pride while describing his success. Then came the moment I'd been dreading without even realizing I was dreading it. My father cleared his throat. That authoritative sound that had commanded boardroom attention for 3 decades as the CEO of Blackwell Industries, the family manufacturing company that had built our wealth and reputation in Willowbrook Heights. "Before we continue," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant an important announcement was coming, "your mother and I have something significant to discuss with both of you." I set down my fork, suddenly losing my appetite. There was something about the way he'd said, "both of you," that made it clear this wasn't going to be good news for me. In my family, when they had good news to share, they directed it specifically at the person being honored. When they said, "both of you," it usually meant one of us was about to be elevated while the other was quietly diminished. Harrison straightened in his chair, his expression shifting to that attentive, respectful look he'd mastered. The expression of a son who'd never once disappointed his parents, who'd never once made them question their methods or values. Meanwhile, I found myself unconsciously shrinking back slightly, preparing for whatever blow was about to be delivered. The rain outside seemed to intensify, matching the growing tension in the room. I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, each tick feeling like a countdown to something I wasn't prepared for. My mother reached for her wine glass, took a delicate sip, and then looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it pity? Disappointment? Or something worse? "This concerns the future of our family legacy," my father continued, "and some important decisions that need to be made about responsibility, maturity, and who we can truly count on to carry the Blackwell name forward with the dignity it deserves." As those words settled over the dinner table like a heavy blanket, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my place in this family was about to change. What I didn't know yet was that by tomorrow morning, they'd be calling me 47 times, desperate to undo what they were about to set in motion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you about the moment that changed everything. The moment when my own brother looked me in the eye and called me worthless, and my parents not only allowed it, but agreed with him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the Blackwell family hierarchy, a carefully constructed system that had been in place since I was old enough to sit at the dinner table without a booster seat. At Nice. The top sat my father, Richard Blackwell, a man who'd built Blackwell Industries from a small manufacturing operation into a multi-million-dollar empire specializing in precision medical equipment. Everything about him commanded respect. His steel gray hair was always perfectly styled, his suits were custom-tailored on Savile Row, and his handshake could close deals worth millions. He was the kind of man who'd never had to raise his voice to get what he wanted because his quiet authority was enough to bend rooms full of executives to his will. Richard Blackwell didn't just run a company. He ran our family with the same strategic precision he applied to hostile takeovers. Every decision was calculated. Every relationship was evaluated for its potential return on investment, and every child was expected to contribute to the greater Blackwell legacy. Failure wasn't just disappointing. It was a reflection of poor judgment, weak character, and insufficient breeding. Then there was my mother, Isabella Blackwell, née Worthington, a woman whose maiden name still opened doors in the most exclusive circles of Willowbrook Heights. She'd been raised in the kind of old money that whispered rather than shouted, where worth was measured not by what you earned, but by what your family had accumulated over generations of careful marriages and strategic social positioning. Isabella had never worked a day in her life, but she wielded influence like a surgeon wielded a scalpel, with precision, purpose, and devastating effectiveness. Isabella's domain was the social architecture of our family's reputation. She orchestrated charity galas that raised hundreds of thousands for worthy causes, while simultaneously cementing the Blackwell name among the philanthropic elite. She served on the boards of the Willowbrook Art Museum, the Children's Hospital Foundation, and the Pemberton Academy, the private school where both Harrison and I had been educated alongside the children of senators, judges, and Fortune 500 CEOs. But perhaps most importantly, Isabella was the family's chief image consultant. She had an uncanny ability to present our family's story in whatever light served us best. When Harrison struggled with organic chemistry during his sophomore year, at Harvard it became a learning opportunity that taught him the value of perseverance. When I switched my major from pre-med to computer science, it became Sophia's little rebellion phase that we hope she'll outgrow. And then there was Harrison, golden, boy, heir apparent, and living proof that the Blackwell blueprint for success actually worked. At 31, Harrison had achieved everything our parents had dreamed of and more. His medical career wasn't just successful, it was prestigious. He wasn't just treating patients, he was pioneering surgical techniques that were being studied at medical schools across the country. His engagement to Charlotte Pemberton wasn't just a marriage. It was a strategic alliance between two of Willowbrook Heights' most influential families. Harrison had inherited our father's commanding presence and our mother's social intelligence, creating a combination that made him effortlessly magnetic. He could charm elderly board members at hospital fundraisers, command respect from colleagues twice his age, and still find time to play tennis at the country club every Saturday morning. He was the son who'd never caused our parents a moment of worry, never made them question their methods, never forced them to explain or defend his choices to their social circle. But here's what made Harrison truly dangerous. He was genuinely good at being the perfect son. This wasn't an act or a facade. He actually believed in the family values, embraced the expectations, and thrived under the pressure that had always felt suffocating to me. He wasn't rebelling against anything because he'd never felt the need to. The path our parents had laid out for him felt natural, comfortable, and aligned with his own ambitions. Which brings us to me, Sophia, the family anomaly. Where Harrison had embraced tradition, I'd questioned it. Where he'd excelled in the subjects our parents valued, I'd found passion in fields they didn't understand. Where he'd chosen a career that impressed at dinner parties, I'd chosen one that made people's eyes glaze over when I tried to explain what I actually did for a living. I worked as a senior systems architect for Meridian Tech Solutions, a mid-sized company that specialized in developing cybersecurity protocols for financial institutions. It was challenging, well-paying, and absolutely crucial work in an increasingly digital world. But try explaining the intricacies of blockchain security and threat mitigation to a table full of doctors, lawyers, and real estate moguls, and you'd quickly understand why I'd learned to simply say, "I work in computers," and change the subject. Chattuquara. Irony wasn't lost on me that the medical equipment manufactured by my father's company relied heavily on the kind of cybersecurity systems I helped design. Blackwell Industries' latest patient monitoring devices were essentially sophisticated computers that happened to save lives. But somehow my expertise in the technology that made them possible was considered less valuable than Harrison's ability to use them. This hierarchy had been reinforced in countless small ways throughout our lives. When we were children, Harrison's soccer trophies were displayed prominently in my father's study, while my debate team medals were relegated to a shelf in the hallway. During family vacations, Harrison's interest in visiting medical museums was catered to, while my fascination with technology centers was dismissed as not really vacation appropriate. As we got older, the disparities became more subtle, but no less impactful. Harrison's achievements were announced at family gatherings and shared with pride among our parents' social circle. My accomplishments were acknowledged privately, with qualified praise that always seemed to include suggestions for how I could build on this to pursue something more substantial. When Harrison bought his first house, an elegant colonial in the prestigious Elmhurst district, our parents helped with the down payment and threw a housewarming party that was featured in the Willowbrook Heights Lifestyle magazine. When I received my first major promotion and moved to a beautiful apartment with a view of downtown Millfield, I got a congratulatory phone call and a suggestion that I should start thinking about more permanent housing arrangements. perhaps something closer to family. The message was always clear. Harrison's choices were worthy of celebration and support, while mine were stepping stones toward eventually making better choices. Choices that aligned with Blackwell family values. But what our parents never realized, what they couldn't see through their carefully constructed expectations, was that I'd been building something too. While they were dismissing my career as playing with computers, I'd been quietly establishing myself as one of the most sought-after cybersecurity experts on the East Coast. While they were hoping I'd outgrow this phase, I'd been developing innovations that were being implemented by companies they'd actually heard of. The problem was, I'd learned to keep these achievements to myself. Years of having my successes minimized or redirected had taught me that sharing good news with my family often resulted in lectures about how I could leverage this success into something more appropriate for a Blackwell. So I'd stopped trying to impress them. I'd stopped hoping for the kind of unconditional pride and support that Harrison received as naturally as breathing. I'd made peace with being the family disappointment, the child who'd chosen her own path over the one that had been carefully planned for her. Or at least, I thought I had made peace with it. What I didn't realize was that my parents had been making their own peace with something, a decision about which of their children truly embodied the Blackwell legacy, and which one had become a liability they could no longer afford to carry. The thing about being consistently underestimated is that it gives you a unique kind of freedom. The freedom to work without scrutiny, to build without interference, and to prepare for moments you hope will never come, but somehow know inevitably will. While my family saw a daughter who'd chosen an unconventional path and never quite measured up to their standards, I'd been quietly constructing something they couldn't comprehend, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they'd never bothered to look closely enough to understand what I was actually doing with my life. 3 years ago, I'd stopped trying to translate my achievements into language they'd appreciate. The last time I'd attempted to share a professional victory with them, a cybersecurity protocol I'd developed that prevented a major banking chain from losing $17 million to hackers, my mother had smiled politely and asked if this meant I might finally consider going back to school for an MBA. Something more business-like, she'd suggested, that could help you transition into a more stable career path. That conversation had been a turning point for me, though I hadn't realized it at the time. I'd driven home to my apartment in downtown, Millfield, feeling deflated and misunderstood, wondering why I continued to seek approval from people who seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding my world. But somewhere between the frustration and the familiar ache of being dismissed, something else had emerged. A quiet determination to stop performing for an audience that would never appreciate the show. So I'd gone underground, professionally, speaking. I'd stopped mentioning promotions, stopped sharing exciting projects, stopped hoping that this achievement might be the one that finally earned me the kind of respect Harrison received for simply existing. Instead, I'd channeled all that energy into building something extraordinary, something that had been growing in scope and significance while my family remained blissfully unaware of its existence. The irony was that my work had become increasingly high-profile within my actual industry. 6 months ago, I'd been featured on the cover of Cybersecurity Quarterly as one of 30 Under 30, the next generation of digital defense innovators. The article had detailed my development of something called the Meridian Protocol, a revolutionary approach to real-time threat detection that had been licensed by 43 major corporations and was being implemented by government agencies I wasn't allowed to name publicly. But my parents had never seen that magazine. They moved in circles where cybersecurity was something you outsourced to technical people, not something you understood or celebrated. Harrison had probably glanced at the cover during a waiting room visit, and never made the connection between the professional headshot and his little sister who played with computers. The financial implications of my work had been even more invisible to them. While they assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck in my modest apartment, the reality was quite different. The licensing deals for the Meridian Protocol had generated substantial royalties. The consulting contracts with Fortune 500 companies had paid even better. And the equity stake I'd negotiated when Meridian Tech Solutions had been acquired by a larger firm 18 months ago had resulted in a payout that exceeded Harrison's annual salary as a chief resident. But perhaps most significantly, I'd been approached by venture capital firms interested in funding my own cybersecurity startup. Not as an employee or a junior partner, but as the founder and CEO of what they were calling the next major disruption in digital security. The preliminary funding offer sitting in my secure email account was for $12 million, money that would allow me to build my own company, hire my own team, and establish myself as a major player in an industry that was becoming more critical every day. I hadn't accepted the offer yet, though. Something had been holding me back, some lingering attachment to the idea that maybe, eventually, my family would come to understand and appreciate what I'd built. Maybe there would be a moment when they'd realize that their definition of success had been too narrow, that there were different ways to make a meaningful contribution to the world. But as I sat at that dinner table, watching my father prepare to make his important announcement about family legacy and responsibility, I was beginning to understand that such a moment might never come. And more troubling still, I was starting to realize that waiting for their approval had become a limitation, not just on my happiness, but on my potential. The apartment they thought of as modest was actually a carefully chosen space in one of Millfield's most desirable neighborhoods. The building had been converted from a historic textile factory, and my unit featured exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a workspace where I'd developed some of my most innovative security protocols. It wasn't impressive by Blackwell standards, because it wasn't trying to be. It was functional, comfortable, and entirely mine, in a way the family estate had never been. More importantly, it was where I'd been building relationships that actually mattered. My professional network included some of the most brilliant minds in technology, people who understood the significance of my work and valued my contributions. I'd been invited to speak at conferences, consulted on projects that protected critical infrastructure, and recognized by peers who didn't need my achievements translated into terms they could understand. I'd also been building something else, a different definition of success, one that prioritized innovation over tradition, impact over status, and authentic accomplishment over inherited position. It was a definition that my family would never embrace, but one that felt increasingly natural to me. The evening before this dinner, I'd received a call from Dr. Rebecca Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, who ran the cybersecurity program at MIT. She'd offered me a position as a visiting professor, with the opportunity to teach graduate-level courses while continuing my research and development work. It was the kind of opportunity that could establish me as not just a practitioner, but a thought leader in my field. I'd also received an email from Sarah Martinez, the venture capital partner who'd been courting me for months. The funding offer had increased to $15 million, with additional support for recruiting top talent and establishing partnerships with major tech companies. She'd attached a draft press release announcing the formation of my new company with a tagline that made me smile: redefining digital security for the next generation. But perhaps most significantly, I'd been contacted by someone from the Department of Homeland Security about a classified project involving critical infrastructure protection. The details were limited, but the implication was clear. My work had caught the attention of people responsible for national security, and they wanted my expertise on something that could affect millions of lives. These opportunities represented everything I'd been working toward: recognition, resources, and the chance to build something meaningful on my own terms. They also represented a future that was completely independent of my family's approval or support. For the first time in my life, I had options that didn't require me to convince anyone of my worth or translate my achievements into language they'd find acceptable. As my father cleared his throat and prepared to deliver his announcement, I found myself in an unexpectedly powerful position. Whatever he was about to say, whatever judgment he was about to render about my life and choices, it no longer had the power to define my future. I had built something substantial, something valuable, something entirely my own. The question was whether they were about to force me to choose between the family I'd been trying to please and the future I'd been building despite their indifference. And increasingly, I was becoming comfortable with the idea that if such a choice became necessary, I knew exactly which path I would take. What I didn't expect was just how dramatically they were about to make that choice for me, or how completely they were about to underestimate what they were walking away from when they decided I wasn't worth keeping. My father's announcement began with the kind of preamble that corporate executives use when they're about to deliver news that will fundamentally alter someone's life. Measured words that sound reasonable on the surface, but carry the weight of irrevocable decisions underneath. As you both know, Richard began, setting his wine glass down with deliberate precision, Blackwell Industries has been expanding rapidly over the past 18 months. The acquisition of MedTech Dynamics and our new partnership with the European Medical Device Consortium have positioned us for unprecedented growth. I watched Harrison straighten slightly, his expression shifting into what I recognized as his receiving important information face. This was the look he wore during medical briefings, the one that conveyed respect, attention, and readiness to step up to whatever challenge was being presented. It was the face of someone who'd never doubted that important announcements would include opportunities rather than ultimatums. The board has been pressuring me to establish a clear succession plan, my father continued, not just for the company, but for the family foundation, our charitable commitments, and our position. In the Willowbrook Heights community, they want to see the next generation of Blackwell leadership clearly defined and actively involved. I felt my stomach tighten, though I couldn't yet pinpoint why. Something about the way he'd said next generation and clearly defined suggested that this conversation wasn't going to be about expanding opportunities for both of his children. The corporate language was too precise, too final, for that kind of inclusive announcement. Isabella leaned forward slightly, her manicured fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "What your father is trying to say," she interjected with the kind of diplomatic smoothness she'd perfected through decades of navigating delicate social situations, "is that we've reached a point where certain decisions can no longer be postponed." Harrison nodded thoughtfully, as if he were already processing the strategic implications of whatever was coming. "Are you talking about bringing family members onto the board?" he asked. "Because I'd certainly be interested in learning more about the business side of operations." My father smiled, the kind of smile that appeared when someone had given exactly the right answer to an unstated question. "That's precisely the kind of forward-thinking attitude we need, Harrison. The kind of commitment to family legacy that builds generational success." And there it was, the subtle but unmistakable indication that Harrison had already passed some test I hadn't even realized was being administered. The way my father's approval settled over my brother like a comfortable coat. The way my mother's expression softened. With satisfaction, it was clear that whatever announcement was coming, Harrison was going to be positioned as the solution to a problem, which meant I was about to be identified as the problem itself. "The reality is," my father continued, turning his attention toward me for the first time since beginning this speech, "that Blackwell Industries is entering a phase where every decision, every partnership, every public representation of our family affects our reputation and our business relationships. We can't afford to have conflicting messages about what the Blackwell name represents." I set down my fork carefully, my appetite disappearing entirely. "Conflicting messages?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this was heading. Isabella took over, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when delivering criticism disguised as concern. "Sophia, darling, we've been patient while you've explored your interests and found your footing. But at some point, exploration needs to evolve into commitment, real commitment to building something substantial. I have built something substantial, I said quietly, though even as I spoke, I knew they wouldn't understand or acknowledge what I meant. My career is your career, my father interrupted, and I could hear the dismissiveness creeping into his voice. Is admirable for what it is, but it's not compatible with the level of responsibility and public representation that comes with being a Blackwell family leader. Harrison cleared his throat, and I could see him trying to look supportive even as he was clearly being positioned as the favored alternative. Maybe there's a way to bridge that gap, he said diplomatically. Sophia could transition into something more aligned with the family business, or perhaps take on a different kind of role in the foundation work. But my father was already shaking his head. Harrison, your intention to find a compromise is admirable, but the situation has progressed beyond that kind of solution. The board has made it clear that they need to see unified family leadership. They need to know that the next generation of Blackwells will represent our values, our standards, and our commitment to the kind of excellence that built this company. The word unified hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel the conversation narrowing toward an ultimatum, though the exact nature of it remained unclear. All I knew was that I was being positioned as the obstacle to some grand vision of family unity and corporate success. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. My mother exchanged a meaningful look with my father before responding. We've discussed this extensively, and we believe it would be best for everyone, including you, dear, if you took some time to reassess your priorities and consider what kind of life you really want to build. What kind of life I want to build, I repeated, feeling like I was trying to decode a foreign language. A serious life, my father said bluntly. A life that reflects the values and standards you were raised with. Not this experimental phase you've been pursuing. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that the conversation had taken a harsher turn than he'd expected. Dad, maybe we could… Harrison, this doesn't concern you directly, Isabella said firmly. You've consistently demonstrated the kind of judgment and commitment we value. This is about helping Sophia understand what's expected of someone who wants to remain part of this family's future. The phrase, remain part of this family's future, hit me like a physical blow. The implication was crystal clear. My continued inclusion in the Blackwell family was conditional, and those conditions were about to be explicitly stated. Here's what we've decided, my father said, his voice shifting into the authoritative tone he used for closing business deals. Sophia, you have 6 months to demonstrate a serious commitment to building the kind of life that aligns with Blackwell family values. That means pursuing a career path that has clear prestige and advancement potential, law, business, medicine, something that commands respect in our community. It also means, my mother added, making a genuine effort to connect with the kind of people who can help you build a proper social foundation. Charlotte has several friends who would be wonderful influences, young women who've made excellent marriages, and could help you understand what you should be looking for in a life partner. I stared at them, trying to process what I was hearing. They were essentially demanding that I abandon the career I'd spent years building, the expertise I'd developed, the professional relationships I'd cultivated, and the opportunities I'd earned, all in favor of starting over in a field they deemed more appropriate. And if I don't? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. My father's expression hardened. Then you'll need to accept that your choices have taken you in a direction that's incompatible with being part of this family's legacy. We'll always love you, of course, but we can't continue to support or include someone whose life choices reflect poorly on the Blackwell name. The ultimatum was delivered with the kind of calm finality that suggested this wasn't a negotiation. It was a business decision, presented with corporate efficiency and wrapped in language about family values and legacy preservation. What they didn't realize was that they'd just made the easiest decision of my life for me. They'd finally shown me exactly how little they understood about who I was, what I'd accomplished, and what I was worth. And in doing so, they'd freed me from any remaining obligation to seek their approval or inclusion. I looked around the table, at my father's expectant expression, my mother's diplomatic smile, and Harrison's uncomfortable recognition that he was being used as a weapon against his own sister. And for the first time in years, I felt completely, perfectly clear about what I needed to do next. The silence that followed my father's ultimatum stretched for perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking each second, the soft patter of rain against the windows, and the almost imperceptible sound of my own breathing as I processed what had just been laid before me. 6 months to abandon everything I'd built. 6 months to transform myself into someone they could be proud of. 6 months to prove I was worthy of remaining a Blackwell. I reached for my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, using the time to organize my thoughts. There was something almost meditative about the coolness of the crystal against my lips, the way the simple act of drinking water could ground you in a moment when everything else felt surreal. When I set the glass down, I noticed that my hand was perfectly steady. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel angry or hurt or desperate to defend myself. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when dealing with my family: complete clarity. "That's quite an ultimatum," I said finally, my voice carrying none of the emotion I might have expected. It sounded almost conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the fundamental conditions of my inclusion in the family I'd been born into. My mother shifted slightly in her chair, perhaps expecting a more dramatic response. "Sophia, it's not an ultimatum. It's an opportunity. We're offering you a chance to build something meaningful, something that will serve you well throughout your life." I nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering her perspective. "An opportunity. I see." I paused, letting my gaze move slowly around the table, taking in each of their faces. "Can I ask you something?" My father gestured for me to continue, though I could see the wariness in his expression. He was a man accustomed to controlling conversations, and something about my calm demeanor was clearly not following the script he'd anticipated. "In your assessment of my current career path," I began, choosing my words carefully, "what exactly do you understand about what I do for a living?" Isabella waved her hand dismissively. "Darling, you work with computers. We understand that. But surely you can see that it's not the kind of work that builds the foundation for a substantial life." "Computers," I repeated slowly. "And what do you think I do with computers?" Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sophia, I think what Mom and Dad are trying to say is that regardless of the technical details, it's about the bigger picture, the social implications, the networking opportunities, the long-term career trajectory." I turned my attention to my brother, noting the way he was trying to mediate while still maintaining his position as the favored child. "Harrison, you're a surgeon. When you're operating on a child's heart, what ensures that the monitoring equipment accurately tracks their vital signs? What prevents hackers from accessing patient records? What protects the hospital's systems from cyber attacks that could shut down life support equipment?" He looked puzzled by the question. I assume there are technical people who handle that kind of thing." "Technical people," I said softly. "Like me." My father's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Sophia, we're not questioning whether your work has some utility. We're talking about building a life of substance, of influence, of lasting impact." I leaned back in my chair, feeling an unexpected sense of calm wash over me. For years, I'd been trying to translate my achievements into language they'd understand, attempting to bridge the gap between their values and mine. But sitting here now, listening to them dismiss my life's work as playing with computers, I realized something profound. I no longer needed their understanding. Lasting impact, I mused. That's interesting. Can you define what you mean by that? Isabella's smile was becoming strained. Impact that matters, dear. Work that affects important people, that builds relationships with influential families, that contributes to society in ways that are recognized and respected. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing this wisdom. So impact is measured by the social status of the people it affects, and by whether the contributions are recognized by the kind of people you consider important. Essentially, yes, my father said, clearly pleased that I seemed to be grasping their point. I see. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, setting it gently on the table. In that case, I think there might be some things you should know before I respond to your generous offer. The word generous carried just enough subtle inflection to suggest irony, though I delivered it with a perfectly straight face. Harrison glanced at the phone, then back at me, clearly sensing that the dynamics of the conversation were about to shift. You see, I continued, my voice remaining perfectly calm, I've been operating under the assumption that you weren't interested in the details of my work because you were respecting my independence and trusting my judgment. I realize now that you simply haven't been paying attention. My mother's smile faltered slightly. Sophia, we've always been interested in your life. Have you? I asked gently. Because I'm about to share some information that might surprise you. Information that suggests your assessment of my career trajectory may have been based on incomplete data. I could see my father's business instincts kicking in. He was a man who'd built his fortune on information, gathering it, analyzing it, and acting on it. The suggestion that he'd been operating without complete information clearly made him uncomfortable. What kind of information? He asked, his tone shifting slightly. I picked up my phone and opened my email app, scrolling to a message I'd received 3 days earlier. This is from Janet Morrison, the CEO of Zenith Financial Corporation. You know Zenith, don't you, Dad? I believe they're one of your largest equipment clients. My father nodded slowly. Zenith was indeed a major client, one of the premier financial institutions in the region. Janet wanted to personally thank me for the cybersecurity protocol that prevented their systems from being compromised last month. The attack would have affected $17 billion in assets and potentially exposed the personal financial information of 4 million customers. I looked up from my phone, meeting my father's gaze directly. $17 billion, Dad. 4 million people. Would you consider that the kind of impact that affects important people? The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause. This wasn't contemplative quiet. This was the sound of assumptions being shattered in real time. But more importantly, I continued, setting the phone aside, Janet mentioned something interesting in her email. She said that when she recommended our security protocols to other CEOs in her network, several of them asked if I might be related to Richard Blackwell of Blackwell Industries. My mother's face had gone pale. They know who you are? Apparently, I've developed something of a reputation in their circles, I said, with the same calm tone I'd maintained throughout the conversation. Janet thought you'd be proud to know that your daughter was being discussed in boardrooms across the Northeast as one of the most innovative cybersecurity experts in the industry. I paused, letting that information settle before continuing. Of course, I told her that my family wasn't particularly interested in my professional accomplishments, so she probably shouldn't expect you to be familiar with my work. Harrison was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Sophia, I had no idea. No, I said quietly. You didn't. None of you did. And that's actually been quite liberating because it's allowed me to build something substantial without worrying about whether it met with your approval or fit into your definition of success. I could see my father's mind working, trying to recalibrate his understanding of the situation. But I wasn't finished yet. The conversation they'd started was about to take a direction none of them had anticipated, and I was just getting started. Could see the wheels turning in my father's mind as he processed what I'd just told him about Zenith Financial. Richard Blackwell hadn't built a multi-million-dollar company by ignoring important information, and the revelation that his unsuccessful daughter was being discussed favorably in the same boardrooms where he conducted business was clearly requiring some mental recalibration. "Sophia," he said carefully, "when you say you've developed a reputation in these circles, what exactly do you mean?" I smiled, not with smugness, but with the quiet confidence of someone who was finally ready to set the record straight. I mean, that over the past 3 years, I've become something of a sought-after expert in cybersecurity consulting. The Meridian protocol that I developed has been implemented by 43 major corporations, including several that I believe you've done business with. Isabella leaned forward, her social instincts clearly sensing that this conversation was moving into territory that could affect the family's reputation in ways she hadn't anticipated. The Meridian protocol? It's a revolutionary approach to real-time threat detection and response, I explained, using the same patient tone I might use with a client who wasn't technically sophisticated. Think of it as an immune system for computer networks. It identifies threats before they can cause damage and adapts to new types of attacks automatically. Harrison was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the tolerant amusement he usually displayed when I talked about my work, but genuine respect mixed with confusion. That sounds significant. It has been, I acknowledged. Significant enough that I was featured on the cover of Cybersecurity Quarterly 6 months ago as one of the industry's most innovative young professionals. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. I could practically hear my parents' worldview reshuffling as they tried to reconcile their image of their struggling daughter with the reality of someone important enough to be featured on magazine covers in her field. 6 months ago? My mother repeated faintly. And you never mentioned— I stopped mentioning my professional achievements to this family 3 years ago, I said matter-of-factly. After the banking security incident I told you about resulted in a lecture about getting an MBA to make my career more businesslike. It became clear that you weren't interested in understanding what I actually do. You were interested in convincing me to do something else. My father's expression had shifted into what I recognized as his business analysis mode. If what you're saying is accurate, and you've developed technology that's being used by major corporations, then the financial implications are probably different from what you've assumed, I finished for him. Yes, they are. I picked up my phone again and opened a different app, one that showed real-time financial data. The licensing agreements for the Meridian protocol generated $2.8 million in revenue last year alone. The consulting contracts brought in another $1.6 million. And the equity stake I negotiated when Meridian Tech Solutions was acquired resulted in a payout that I believe exceeds Harrison's annual salary as a chief resident. Harrison choked on his wine. Sophia, are you saying you made more money last year than I did? Considerably more, I said simply. But that's not really the point. The point is that while you've been worried about my ability to build a substantial life, I've been building exactly that. Just not in a way that fits your definition of substance. Isabella was staring at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. But your apartment, your lifestyle, you live so modestly. I live deliberately, I corrected. I chose my apartment because it's in a neighborhood I enjoy, close to my office, and it meets my needs perfectly. I didn't choose it to impress anyone or because it was the most expensive option available. There's a difference. I could see my father's business mind working through the implications. If you're generating that kind of revenue, then your work is clearly more substantial than we understood. Much more substantial, I agreed. But here's what's really interesting. The recognition I've received hasn't come from the social circles you value. It's come from people who understand the work itself. who can evaluate its merit based on its actual impact rather than its perceived prestige. I swiped to another email on my phone. This is from Dr. Rebecca Chen at MIT. She's offered me a position as a visiting professor in their cybersecurity program, with the opportunity to teach graduate-level courses while continuing my research and development work. My mother's hand went to her throat, a gesture she made when she was processing information that challenged her fundamental assumptions. MIT wants you to teach? They want me to help shape the next generation of cybersecurity professionals, I clarified. It's the kind of academic appointment that typically goes to people with decades of experience. But my work with the Meridian Protocol has established me as what they're calling a thought leader in the field. Harrison set down his wine glass, with obvious care, as if he were afraid his hands might be shaking. Sophia, I owe you an apology. I had no idea that you'd achieved this level of professional recognition. I've been thinking of your work as something you were doing until you figured out what you really wanted to do with your life. I know, I said gently. And I understand why you thought that. I stopped trying to correct those assumptions, because it became exhausting to constantly defend the value of work that none of you made any effort to understand. My father cleared his throat, and I could see him struggling to recalibrate his entire approach to this conversation. Sophia, if what you're telling us is accurate, and I'm not questioning your honesty, then it seems we may have miscalculated the trajectory of your career. You may have, I agreed, but that's not the most significant miscalculation you've made. The way I said those words, calm, measured, but carrying an unmistakable promise of more revelations to come, caused a visible shift in the atmosphere around the table. My family was beginning to realize that they'd walked into this conversation with incomplete information, and that I'd been controlling the flow of new data with surgical precision. What do you mean? Isabella asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. I reached into my purse and pulled out a leather portfolio, setting it on the table with the same deliberate care I'd used with my phone. I mean that what I've told you so far represents my past achievements. What's in this portfolio represents my future opportunities. Opportunities that your ultimatum has forced me to consider much more seriously than I had been. My father's eyes fixed on the portfolio with the intensity he usually reserved for critical business documents. What kind of opportunities? The kind that would make this conversation about abandoning my career path somewhat ironic, I said, opening the portfolio to reveal the first page of a formal document with letterhead that even my parents would recognize. This, I said, turning the document so they could see it clearly, is a venture capital funding offer. $15 million in initial funding to establish my own cybersecurity company, with additional rounds of funding available based on performance milestones. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ice settling in my water glass. My family wasn't just processing new information anymore. They were confronting the possibility that everything they thought they knew about me, my capabilities, and my future prospects had been fundamentally wrong, and I was just getting started. The venture capital document sat on the table between us like a small bomb that had just detonated, leaving my family in stunned silence. $15 million. The number seemed to hang in the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss as another one of my little computer projects. My father was the first to recover his composure, though I could see the effort it took. 15 million, he said slowly, as if testing the words. For a startup company. For my startup company, I corrected gently. Based on technology I developed, protocols I designed, and innovations that I hold the intellectual property rights to. The funding would allow me to hire a team of the best cybersecurity professionals in the country and establish what the investors are calling the next major disruption in digital security. I flipped to the next page in the portfolio, revealing a detailed business plan with financial projections that would have made sense in my father's world. Revenue estimates, market penetration strategies, competitive analysis. The preliminary projections show potential annual revenue of $50 million within 3 years, with expansion into international markets projected to double that figure by year 5. Harrison leaned forward, his medical training having taught him to pay attention to details when the stakes were high. Sophia, this is a Fortune 500 company you're talking about building, from scratch. It's not theoretical, I said, turning to another section of the portfolio. This is a letter of intent from the Department of Homeland Security. They're interested in implementing my security protocols across critical infrastructure systems, power, grids, transportation networks, financial institutions. The contract value would be approximately $800 million over 5 years. My mother's wine glass slipped slightly in her hand, and I watched a small amount of red wine splash onto the white tablecloth. She didn't seem to notice. 800 million? From the government? From Homeland Security specifically, I clarified. My work caught their attention after the Zenith financial incident I mentioned earlier. Preventing a $17 billion cyber attack tends to get noticed by people whose job it is to protect national infrastructure. I could see my father's mind working through the implications, applying the same analytical process he used when evaluating business opportunities. If the government is willing to commit that kind of funding, then the technology must be revolutionary, I finished. Yes, it is. The traditional approach to cybersecurity is reactive. You build walls and wait for someone to try to break through them. My approach is predictive and adaptive. The system learns from attack patterns and evolves its defenses in real time. It's not just better than what currently exists, it's fundamentally different. I reached into the portfolio again and pulled out a thick folder. These are letters from CEOs of companies you definitely know. Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all requesting private consultations about implementing my security protocols for their trading systems and customer data protection. Isabella was staring at the folder as if it contained state secrets. All of those banks want to hire you personally? They want exclusive access to my technology, I said. Each of those letters includes an offer for what they call strategic partnership agreements. The smallest offer is for $12 million annually. The largest is for $35 million, plus equity stakes in a joint cybersecurity venture. The numbers were clearly becoming overwhelming for my family to process. I could see them struggling to reconcile their image of their unsuccessful daughter with the reality of someone who was fielding offers worth tens of millions of dollars from the most powerful financial institutions in the country. But here's what's really interesting, I continued, pulling out another document. This is from Sarah Martinez at Pinnacle Venture Partners. She's been courting me for 8 months, and her latest offer has some fascinating details. I opened the document to a specific section that I'd highlighted in yellow. Sarah did extensive research into my background before making her initial offer. She discovered that I'm Richard Blackwell's daughter, and she was surprised that there hadn't been any collaboration between my technology work and Blackwell Industries' medical device manufacturing. My father's expression sharpened with obvious interest. What kind of collaboration? Medical devices are essentially sophisticated computers that happen to save lives, I explained. Pacemakers, insulin pumps, surgical robots, patient monitoring. Systems, they're all vulnerable to the same kinds of cyber attacks that threaten banks and power grids. Sarah's research indicated that Blackwell Industries could become the first medical device manufacturer to offer completely secure products by integrating my security protocols at the hardware level. I turned to a financial projection that Sarah's team had prepared. The competitive advantage would be enormous. Hospitals and medical practices are becoming increasingly concerned about cybersecurity, but most medical device manufacturers treat it as an afterthought. A company that could guarantee hack-proof medical equipment could potentially dominate the market. The The projection showed revenue estimates that dwarfed even Blackwell Industries' current success. Sarah's team calculated that a partnership between my cybersecurity technology and your manufacturing capabilities could create a billion-dollar market opportunity within 5 years. I could see my father's pupils dilate slightly, the same reaction I'd seen when he was evaluating particularly lucrative business deals. $1 billion? Conservative estimate, I said matter-of-factly. The international market for secure medical devices is essentially unlimited. Every hospital in the world needs equipment they can trust not to be compromised by hackers, and currently, no one can provide that guarantee. Harrison was looking between me and our father with an expression of dawning realization. Dad, if Sophia's technology could be integrated into our products, it would revolutionize our entire industry, my father finished, his voice carrying the kind of excitement I'd rarely heard from him. We could corner the market on secure medical devices. You could, I agreed. Sarah's offer actually includes a specific provision for family business collaboration. She assumes that someone with my background would naturally want to work with her father's company, combining technological innovation with established manufacturing expertise. I paused, letting that information settle before delivering the next piece of evidence. Of course, Sarah's offer is contingent on my being available to focus entirely on building the company. She's concerned that personal distractions or family complications could interfere with the kind of intensive work required to bring revolutionary technology to market. The irony was so perfect that I almost felt sorry for my parents. Here they were, demanding that I abandon my career to pursue something more substantial, while simultaneously learning that my career represented opportunities that could transform their own business beyond their wildest dreams. Personal distractions, my mother repeated faintly. Family complications, I added, meeting her gaze directly. Sarah specifically asked whether I had family support for pursuing this opportunity, or whether there might be conflicting priorities that could compromise my ability to commit fully to building the company. I closed the portfolio and set it aside, then looked around the table at my family's stunned faces. So, when you offered me 6 months to prove that I could build a substantial life, you were essentially asking me to delay accepting opportunities worth hundreds of millions of dollars in order to pursue careers that would generate a fraction of what I'm already earning. The silence that followed was profound. My family wasn't just processing new information anymore. They were confronting the complete inversion of everything they thought they understood about success, failure, and the relative value of our respective career paths. And I still had one more revelation that would change everything. The atmosphere in the dining room had shifted so dramatically that it felt like we were sitting in an entirely different house. The confident authority my parents had wielded just an hour ago had evaporated, replaced by a dawning recognition that they'd been operating with catastrophically incomplete information. But I wasn't finished yet. The final revelation, the one that would complete the power reversal, was still coming. I reached for my phone one more time, scrolling to a contact I'd been saving for exactly this moment. There's one more thing you should probably know before we continue this conversation about my future, I said, my finger hovering over the call button. Something that will help clarify exactly what decision you're asking me to make. My father's expression had evolved from surprised confusion to sharp business focus. I could see him trying to process the implications of everything I'd revealed, attempting to calculate how this new information changed not just his understanding of my career, but potentially the future of his own company. What decision? He asked carefully. Instead of answering directly, I pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker. After 2 rings, a crisp, professional voice answered, Sophia, I was hoping you'd call. Do you have an answer for us? Actually, Marcus, I have my family here with me, and I thought they should hear about the offer directly from you. Would you mind explaining what we discussed yesterday? There was a brief pause, then the voice, which I could see my parents, trying to place, continued with obvious enthusiasm. Of course. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Marcus Chen, senior partner at Apex Strategic Acquisitions. We've been in negotiations with your daughter about what we believe could be one of the most significant technology acquisitions of the decade. My mother's eyes widened as she recognized the name. Apex Strategic was one of the most prestigious investment firms in the Northeast, the kind of company that managed portfolios for billionaires and sovereign wealth funds. Yesterday, Marcus continued, we presented Sophia with an offer to acquire her cybersecurity technology, her consulting business, and her intellectual property portfolio. The total acquisition price is $450 million. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each tick seeming unnaturally loud in the stunned quiet of the dining room. $450 million, Harrison repeated weakly, as if saying the number aloud might make it more comprehensible. That's correct, Marcus confirmed. But here's what makes this particularly interesting. The acquisition includes a provision for Sophia to remain as CEO of a new division within our portfolio, with a guaranteed salary of $12 million annually, plus performance bonuses that could easily double that figure. Isabella's wineglass slipped from her fingers entirely this time, shattering against her plate with a sound that seemed to echo the destruction of her assumptions about her daughter's worth. The reason we're so interested, Marcus continued, clearly unaware of the drama unfolding in our dining room, is that Sophia's technology represents a paradigm shift in cybersecurity. We've had it evaluated by the top experts in the field, and they're unanimous in their assessment that this could render current security approaches obsolete within 5 years. My father found his voice, though it sounded strained. Mr. Chen, when you say $450 million, you mean... I mean, that's the amount we're prepared to transfer to Sophia's accounts upon signing, Marcus replied matter-of-factly. Though I should mention that our financial analysis suggests the technology's actual value could be significantly higher once it's fully commercialized. We're essentially betting that Sophia's innovations will be worth several $billion in the long term. I could see Harrison doing mental calculations, his medical training having made him comfortable with large numbers, but clearly struggling with the magnitude of what he was hearing. Several billion? Conservative estimate, Marcus said. The cybersecurity market is experiencing unprecedented growth, and companies that can provide truly revolutionary solutions are positioned to capture enormous market share. Sophia's technology doesn't just improve existing security, it fundamentally reimagines how digital protection works. My father cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control over the conversation. Mr. Chen, I'm Richard Blackwell, Sophia's father. I'm curious about the timeline for this acquisition. Ah, Mr. Blackwell, I was hoping to speak with you. We're actually very interested in the potential for integrating this acquisition with existing family business interests. Our research indicates that Blackwell Industries could benefit enormously from incorporating Sophia's security protocols into your medical device manufacturing. I watched my father's expression shift as the business implications became clear. Not only was his daughter worth nearly $500 million, but her success could potentially transform his own company's prospects. The timeline is flexible, Marcus continued, but we'd prefer to finalize the agreement within the next 30 days. Sophia mentioned that she needed to resolve some family considerations before making her final decision, which is why we've been patient. But frankly, we're eager to move forward. Family considerations? My mother asked faintly. Yes, I said, taking back control of the conversation. I explained to Marcus that my family had some concerns about my career path and that I wanted to make sure everyone was comfortable with my decisions before committing to such a significant change. The irony was so perfect it was almost cruel. Here, my parents had gathered the family to deliver an ultimatum about abandoning my career, while I was actually weighing an offer that would make me one of the wealthiest people in Willowbrook Heights. Marcus, I said into the phone, I think my family needs some time to process this information. Can I call you back tomorrow with my decision? Of course, Sophia. But I hope you'll keep in mind that opportunities like this are rare. We've never made an acquisition offer of this magnitude for a single individual's technology portfolio. After we ended the call, the dining room fell into a silence so profound that it felt almost sacred. My family was staring at me as if I were a complete stranger who had somehow replaced their daughter and sister. $450 million, my father said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Plus the $12 million annual salary, I added helpfully. Though Marcus is right that the performance bonuses could easily double that figure, given the projected growth in the cybersecurity market. Harrison shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear it. Sophia, I don't understand. If you've had opportunities like this available, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think? Why let you think I was struggling? I finished for him. Because I wasn't performing my life for your approval anymore. I was building something meaningful on my own terms, and it turns out that when you stop trying to impress people who don't understand your field, you can accomplish extraordinary things. I looked around the table at my family's stunned faces, taking in the complete reversal of power that had occurred over the course of our conversation. So when you offered me 6 months to prove I could build a substantial life, you were essentially asking me to delay accepting an offer that would make me worth more than our entire family's current net worth combined. My mother was staring at the broken wine glass on her plate as if it held answers to questions she couldn't formulate. I don't understand how we got everything so wrong. You got it wrong, I said gently, because you never asked the right questions. You assumed that because my success didn't look like Harrison's success, it wasn't real success. You measured my worth by your standards instead of trying to understand what I was actually building. My father was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not the dismissive patience he usually showed when I talked about my work, but genuine respect mixed with something that might have been fear. Sophia, he said carefully, what does this mean for our family? It was the first time in my adult life that my father had asked me a question that acknowledged I might hold power in our relationship, and I was about to give him an answer that would change everything. My father's question hung in the air like a challenge. What does this mean for our family? For the first time in my adult life, I held all the power in our relationship, and he was asking, not demanding, what I intended to do with it. I set my phone aside and leaned back in my chair, taking a moment to really look at each of them. My father, the man who had built an empire through sheer determination and strategic thinking, now looked uncertain and almost fragile. My mother, who had navigated the complex social hierarchies of Willowbrook Heights with surgical precision, seemed lost in a world where her careful calculations had proven catastrophically wrong. And Harrison, my golden boy brother who had never questioned the family's values because they had always worked perfectly for him, was staring at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. That's an interesting question, Dad, I said finally, because until about 2 hours ago I was still operating under the assumption that I wanted to be part of this family's future. I thought that maybe, eventually, you'd come to understand and respect what I'd built. I kept hoping that one day we'd have a conversation where you'd be proud of me for who I actually am, rather than disappointed that I'm not who you wanted me to be. Isabella reached for her napkin, dabbing at the wine stain on the tablecloth with the kind of mechanical precision she used when she was avoiding eye contact during difficult conversations. Sophia, we've always been proud of you. No, I said quietly, but with absolute certainty. You've been politely tolerant of me. There's a difference. I pulled out my phone again and scrolled to a folder I'd been building for 3 years, not because I was planning this moment, but because I'd needed to document my experience to maintain my own sanity. Let me read you something. This is from Christmas dinner 2 years ago. You were telling the Pemberton family about Harrison's latest research publication, and when Charlotte asked about my work, you said, and I quote, Sophia is still exploring her options. We're hoping she'll find something more stable soon. My mother's face flushed. I didn't mean... This is from my birthday dinner last year, I continued, scrolling to another entry. when I mentioned that I'd been featured in a trade publication. You changed the subject to ask Harrison about his engagement plans. When I tried to explain what the article was about, you said, "Technical things are so hard to follow. Harrison, tell us more about the venue you've chosen." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sophia, I don't think they meant to dismiss—" "Here's my personal favorite," I interrupted, finding another entry. "This is from the family barbecue last summer. I had just returned from a conference in Silicon Valley where I delivered a keynote address to 2,000 cybersecurity professionals. When I tried to share that experience, Dad said, 'Well, hopefully this hobby of yours will lead to some real networking opportunities.'" The word hobby seemed to echo in the dining room. I could see my father wince as he heard his own dismissive language reflected back at him. "A hobby," I repeated. "That's what you called work that was generating millions of dollars in revenue and protecting critical infrastructure for some of the largest companies in the world." I closed the phone and set it down gently. "So, when you ask what this means for our family, I think the more relevant question is, what did our family mean to me when I was building all of this?" The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about my career success. It was about years of systematic dismissal, of being treated as the family project rather than as an accomplished adult, of having my achievements minimized and my potential questioned. "I kept detailed records," I said, "not because I was planning some kind of revenge, but because I started to doubt my own perceptions. When the people who are supposed to know you best consistently treat your biggest achievements as minor inconveniences, you begin to wonder if you're delusional about your own success." Isabella's voice was barely audible. "We never intended to make you feel that way." "But you did," I said simply. "Every family gathering, every phone call, every conversation about the future was an opportunity for you to show interest in what I was actually doing with my life. Instead, you used those opportunities to redirect me toward what you thought I should be doing." I looked directly at Harrison. "Do you remember what you said to me at your engagement party?" His face went pale. "Sophia, You introduced me to Charlotte's friends as my little sister who's still trying to figure out what she wants to be when she grows up. I was 26 years old and had just closed a consulting contract worth more than most people's annual salaries." Harrison looked stricken. "I was trying to be protective. I thought if I made it sound like you were still exploring, it would take the pressure off you to explain work that other people might not understand." "You were embarrassed by me," I said, not with anger, but with sad clarity. "You were embarrassed that your sister worked in technology instead of a field that impressed your fiancé's family. The accusation hung between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. But Harrison, to his credit, didn't try to deny it." "You're right," he said quietly. "I was embarrassed. Not because I didn't respect your work, but because I didn't understand it well enough to defend it when people made dismissive comments. It was easier to make excuses than to admit my own ignorance. It was the first genuinely honest thing anyone in my family had said all evening. The irony," I continued, "is that while you were all embarrassed by my unconventional career, I was building something that could have elevated this entire family's status in ways you never imagined. The same people who you were worried wouldn't understand my work are now competing to hire me." I gestured toward the portfolio still sitting on the table. "The venture capital offer includes provisions for family business integration. The government contracts could have opened doors to military and intelligence community connections. The banking relationships could have transformed Blackwell Industries into a major player in financial technology." My father's expression was pained. "Sophia, if you had understood, you would have found ways to benefit from my success without ever actually respecting the work that created it," I said, cutting him off. "You would have been proud of the money and the connections, but you still would have seen my career as a stepping stone to something more appropriate. The truth of that statement settled over the table like a heavy blanket. They couldn't deny it because we all knew it was accurate. So when you delivered your ultimatum tonight, I continued, you weren't just asking me to abandon my career. You were asking me to give up the one thing in my life that had never required me to apologize for who I am. You were asking me to walk away from people who respect my expertise and return to a family that sees me as a problem to be solved. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 31 years of trying to earn approval from people who had never bothered to understand what they were approving or disapproving of. The deeper truth, I said, looking around the table one final time, is that I spent so many years trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I wasn't worth understanding. And the saddest part is that even now, even after learning what I've accomplished, your first instinct isn't to apologize for underestimating me. It's to calculate how my success might benefit the family that spent years treating it as an embarrassment. I picked up my portfolio and my phone, preparing to leave the dining room where I'd spent countless meals feeling like a disappointment. So, to answer your question, Dad, what this means for our family is that you no longer get to define my worth or dictate my choices. What happens next depends entirely on whether you're capable of respecting the daughter you actually have, rather than mourning the one you thought you wanted. I had taken 3 steps toward the dining room door when my father's voice stopped me. Not the commanding tone he'd used to deliver his ultimatum, but something I'd rarely heard from him. Genuine desperation. Sophia, please, don't leave like this. I turned back slowly, portfolio still in hand, and looked at him. Richard Blackwell, the man who'd never had to ask for anything in his professional life, was asking his daughter not to walk away. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I wasn't ready to make this easy for any of them. Why shouldn't I leave? I asked. You made your position clear. I have 6 months to abandon everything I've built and prove that I can become someone you consider worthy of the Blackwell name. The only problem is that I no longer care whether you consider me worthy. Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Sophia, we were wrong. Completely, catastrophically wrong. But walking away now after everything you've just told us? After everything I've just told you what? I challenged. Now that you know I'm worth more money than you imagined, suddenly, I'm worth keeping around. Now that you realize my success could benefit your business interests, suddenly my choices deserve respect? The accusation hit its mark. I could see Harrison struggling with the truth of what I'd said, recognizing that his sudden desire to keep me in the family was at least partially motivated by the opportunities I represented. My mother finally looked, up from the wine stain she'd been obsessing over. That's not entirely fair, Sophia, isn't it? I set my portfolio down on the sideboard but remained standing. Let me ask you something, Mom. If Marcus Chen had called during dinner and announced that I'd been fired, that my company had failed, and that I was moving back home to figure out my next steps, would you still be asking me not to leave? Isabella opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The honesty of the question had trapped her between the polite lie she wanted to tell and the uncomfortable truth we all recognized. I see, I said quietly. So your sudden interest in preserving our family relationship is directly proportional to my net worth. That's exactly what I expected. My father cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Sophia, you're being unfair. Yes, we're shocked by what we've learned tonight. Yes, we made serious misjudgments about your career and your capabilities. But our desire to keep you in this family isn't just about money. I crossed my arms and waited. Go on. It's about... He paused, clearly struggling with how to articulate something he'd never had to express before. It's about recognizing that we failed you as parents, not because we didn't love you, but because we loved you according to our own limited understanding of what success looks like. It was closer to an apology than I'd ever received from him, but it wasn't enough. "And now that you have a broader understanding of what success looks like?" I asked. Harrison answered before my father could respond. "Now we're asking for a chance to do better. Not because of your money or your business connections, but because we finally understand how much we've lost by not seeing you clearly." I studied my brother's face, looking for signs of the calculation that usually drove family conversations. What I saw instead was something that looked like genuine regret. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. My father leaned forward, his business instincts kicking in now that he sensed an opening for negotiation. "We start over. No more assumptions about your career, no more suggestions about what you should be doing with your life, no more treating your achievements as stepping stones to something we consider more appropriate. And in return, we learn. We ask questions instead of making judgments. We celebrate your successes on their own terms instead of measuring them against our expectations." I considered this for a moment. That sounds reasonable in theory. But what happens the first time someone at the country club asks you what your daughter does for a living, and you have to explain cybersecurity instead of announcing that I'm a doctor or a lawyer? Isabella flinched slightly. We learn to be proud of the truth instead of embarrassed by our own ignorance. And what happens when Charlotte's friends make dismissive comments about technology work being unstable or unconventional? Harrison's jaw tightened. I defend your career instead of making excuses for it. I educate myself enough about what you do so that I can represent it accurately instead of apologizing for it. These were good answers, but I wasn't ready to accept them at face value. And what happens when I decide to accept the acquisition offer? When I become wealthier than our entire extended family combined? When I'm featured in Forbes and invited to speak at conferences around the world? Are you prepared for your unsuccessful daughter to become the most accomplished member of the Blackwell family? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I was asking them to confront not just their past mistakes, but their future comfort with a fundamental shift in family dynamics. My father was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Sophia, I built Blackwell Industries because I wanted to create something lasting, something that would benefit future generations of our family. What I realize now is that you've already done that. You've built something that could transform not just our financial position, but our entire legacy." He paused, meeting my eyes directly. "If you're willing to stay, if you're willing to give us a chance to earn your respect, then I'm prepared to learn what it means to be proud of a daughter who's already surpassed everything I accomplished." It was the closest thing to humility I'd ever heard from Richard Blackwell. "And I'm prepared," Isabella added quietly, "to learn how to introduce you at social gatherings as exactly who you are, one of the most innovative cybersecurity experts in the country, instead of someone who's still finding her way." Harrison nodded. "And I'm prepared to finally be the brother who brags about his sister's achievements instead of making excuses for them." I looked around the table at my family, really looked at them, and saw something I'd been hoping to see for years. Genuine recognition. Not of my potential, not of what I might become if I followed their guidance, but of what I had already accomplished on my own terms. "All right," I said finally, sitting back down at the table. "But we're going to do this on my terms. Complete honesty, no more diplomatic avoidance of difficult topics, and absolutely no attempts to manage or redirect my career choices." "Agreed," my father said immediately. "And when people ask about our family dynamics, you tell the truth, that you underestimated your daughter for years and that you're still learning to appreciate her success." Isabella nodded. "We can do that. And Harrison," I turned to my brother, "no more protective deflection. If you don't understand something about my work, you ask me to explain it instead of minimizing it to avoid embarrassment." "Done," he said firmly. I reached for my water glass, taking a sip while I considered whether I believed they could actually follow through on these commitments. There's one more thing, I said finally. The acquisition offer comes with a decision, deadline. If I accept it, I'll be relocating to San Francisco for at least 2 years to establish the new division. If I decline it and pursue the venture capital funding instead, I'll be building my company here in Boston, which means I'll be around to see whether you actually mean what you're saying tonight. The implications were clear. They would have multiple opportunities to prove their commitment to respecting my choices, and I would be in a position to evaluate their sincerity over time. "What do you want to do?" my father asked, and for the first time in my life, the question felt like genuine curiosity rather than poorly disguised direction. "I want to build something extraordinary," I said. "And for the first time in my adult life, I think I might actually want my family to be part of watching that happen." The sound of my phone ringing cut through the tentative new understanding we'd been building. I glanced at the screen and felt my heart skip. The caller ID showed Dr. Eleanor Whitman. Dr. Whitman had been my grandmother's best friend for over 40 years, and now served as the executor of her estate. She hadn't called me since the funeral 18 months ago. "I should take this," I said, answering the phone. "Dr. Whitman? Is everything all right?" Her warm, familiar voice carried a note of excitement that seemed oddly out of place for an evening call from an estate executor. "Sophia, my dear, I'm so sorry to call during dinner, but I've just finished reviewing some documents that I think you need to hear about immediately." I could feel my family's attention sharpen around the table. After the revelations of the past few hours, any new information felt potentially significant. "What kind of documents?" "Your grandmother's private papers. I've been going through them systematically, and I found something quite extraordinary. A sealed envelope with very specific instructions about when it should be opened and shared with you." I felt a chill run down my spine. My grandmother, Margaret Blackwell, had been the one person in the family who'd always seemed to understand me, even when I didn't understand myself. She'd passed away during my final year of graduate school, when I was just beginning to develop the technology that would eventually become the Meridian Protocol. "What kind of instructions?" "The envelope was to be opened only if you achieved significant professional recognition in your chosen field, or if the family ever questioned your career choices in a way that made you consider distancing yourself from them." I met my father's eyes across the table, seeing my own surprise reflected in his expression. Somehow, my grandmother had anticipated this exact situation. "Sophia," Dr. Whitman continued, "your grandmother was keeping track of your career much more closely than any of us realized. She had newspaper clippings, magazine articles, even printed emails about your work. She knew about your success years before tonight." "That's impossible," Isabella said, loud enough for Dr. Whitman to hear. "We would have known if Mother was following Sophia's career." "Mrs. Blackwell, is that you?" Dr. Whitman's voice carried a note of gentle reproach. "Your mother-in-law was quite deliberate about not sharing this information with the family. She felt that Sophia needed to build her success without family interference or expectations." I could see my parents exchanging bewildered glances. The idea that my grandmother had been secretly monitoring and celebrating my achievements while they remained oblivious was clearly disturbing to them. "Dr. Whitman, what exactly did my grandmother leave for me?" "Several things, actually. First, a letter explaining her reasoning and her pride in your accomplishments. Second, a trust fund that she established specifically to support your entrepreneurial endeavors." The room went completely silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to pause. "A trust fund?" "Yes, dear. Your grandmother was quite wealthy in her own right. Money that came from her family's textile business, separate from the Blackwell estate. She'd been investing carefully for decades, specifically to support what she called the family member who would have the courage to build something entirely new." I could barely process what I was hearing. "How much?" "The current value is approximately $67 million. If the earlier revelations had been earthquakes, this was a volcanic eruption." My family stared at me with expressions of complete shock, as if I'd somehow orchestrated this moment for maximum dramatic impact. 67 million, Harrison repeated weakly. But there's more, Dr. Whitman continued. Your grandmother also left detailed instructions about how the trust should be used. It's specifically designated to support your cybersecurity company, with provisions for hiring staff, acquiring additional technology, and expanding operations. I felt dizzy. Between the acquisition offer, the venture capital funding, and now, this unexpected inheritance, I was looking at resources that exceeded anything I'd imagined possible. There's one more thing, Sophia. Your grandmother left a letter for your parents as well, explaining why she chose to keep this information private. My father cleared his throat. What does the letter say? Dr. Whitman's voice became more formal. I think it would be appropriate for me to read it to you directly. There was a rustling of papers, then she began. To my son Richard and daughter-in-law Isabella. If you are hearing this letter, it means that Sophia has achieved the success I always knew she was capable of, and that you have finally recognized it as well. My mother's hand went to her throat. I chose not to share my knowledge of Sophia's accomplishments because I wanted her to develop confidence in her own judgment without feeling pressured to perform for family approval. She needed to learn that her worth was not dependent on your understanding or acceptance. The words hung in the air like an indictment. However, I also hoped that eventually you would recognize her value on your own. If you are hearing this letter, I assume that recognition has finally occurred, perhaps prompted by some crisis that forced you to confront your own assumptions. I could see tears forming in Isabella's eyes. My grandmother had understood our family dynamics better than any of us realized. The trust fund I've established for Sophia is not just financial support. It's a statement of faith in her vision and her capabilities. She has already proven that she can build something extraordinary. This money will ensure that she can build something revolutionary. Dr. Whitman paused, then continued with evident emotion in her voice. But most importantly, this inheritance comes with a message for Sophia. You never needed their approval. To be worthy of love and support, you needed only to be yourself, fully and courageously. I am proud of the woman you've become, and I believe you will use these resources to create something that will benefit not just your family, but the world. The silence that followed was profound and sacred. My grandmother, even in death, had found a way to validate everything I'd been trying to prove to my family for years. There's one final provision, Dr. Whitman added gently. The trust includes a stipulation that if you choose to work with family members on business ventures, they must be equal partners, not advisors or directors. Your grandmother wanted to ensure that any collaboration would be based on mutual respect, rather than traditional family hierarchy. I looked around the table at my family's stunned faces, processing the magnitude of what my grandmother had done. She hadn't just left me money. She'd left me complete independence and a clear message about my worth. Dr. Whitman, when can I see the full documentation? I can bring everything to your apartment tomorrow morning, if that works for you. There are some legal documents to sign, but the trust will be immediately accessible. After we ended the call, I sat in the overwhelming quiet of the dining room, holding my phone and trying to comprehend how dramatically my life had changed in the space of a single evening. When I'd arrived for dinner, I was a successful professional being pressured to abandon her career. Now I was looking at resources that would make me one of the most well-funded technology entrepreneurs in the country. But more than the money, more than the opportunities, what struck me most profoundly was the realization that someone had been watching my journey with pride and understanding all along. My grandmother had seen my worth when my own parents couldn't recognize it. $67 million, my father said finally, his voice filled with something between awe and regret. Your grandmother always was smarter than the rest of us, Isabella whispered. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of decisions settling around me like a mantle. She was, and now I need to decide what to do with the faith she placed in me. For the first time in my life, I had every resource I needed to build exactly the future I wanted, with or without my family's involvement. The question was, what kind of future did I want to build? The next morning, I sat in my apartment overlooking downtown Millfield, surrounded by documents that represented more opportunities than I'd ever imagined possible. Dr. Whitman had arrived. At exactly 9 o'clock with my grandmother's trust documentation, the venture capital contracts, and Marcus Chen's acquisition offer. 3 different paths to extraordinary success, each representing a different vision of my future. But first, I had 47 missed calls to address. They'd started at 6:30 in the morning, my parents, Harrison, even Charlotte calling on Harrison's behalf. Voice messages that ranged from frantic apologies to desperate business proposals to emotional pleas for forgiveness. The transformation from the family that had delivered an ultimatum the night before to the family frantically trying to repair. Our relationship was so complete it would have been comedic if it weren't so tragic. I listened to each message carefully, not out of obligation, but because I needed to understand whether their panic was driven by genuine remorse or by the sudden realization of what they'd almost lost financially. Harrison's final message, left at 11:47 p.m. the night before, was the most honest. Sophia, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about all the times I introduced you as someone who was still figuring things out when you'd already figured out more than any of us. I'm not calling because of the money, though I know it might sound that way. I'm calling because I finally understand what grandmother saw in you that we were too blind to recognize. You built something extraordinary while we were busy being embarrassed by it. I'm sorry. Not sorry that we missed the business opportunities, but sorry that we missed celebrating you. That message, more than all the others, convinced me that some of their panic might actually represent genuine regret, rather than pure self-interest. At noon, I called them back. Not individually, but in a conference call that would force them to hear my decision together, just as they'd delivered their ultimatum together. I've made my choice, I said without preamble once they were all on the line. The silence was immediate and complete. I'm declining the acquisition offer. I could hear what sounded like Isabella's sharp intake of breath. I'm also declining the venture capital funding. Sophia, my father's voice was strained. You don't have to make any rash decisions because of what happened last night. We can work through this as a family. I'm not making a rash decision, Dad. I'm making the decision that's right for my vision of what I want to build. I looked out my window at the city where I'd spent years building my reputation and my expertise, where I'd learned to value my own judgment over other people's approval. I'm using grandmother's trust fund to establish my own cybersecurity company here in Boston, but I'm doing it differently than anyone expects. I paused, organizing thoughts I'd been developing since Dr. Whitman left that morning. The company will be called Whitman Cybersecurity Solutions, in honor of the woman who understood my potential before I fully understood it myself. It will be entirely employee-owned, with equity stakes for everyone from senior engineers to administrative staff. No outside investors, no board of directors trying to maximize quarterly profits. No pressure to compromise our principles for market share. Harrison's voice came through the phone with obvious confusion. But, Sophia, the money you're turning down. The opportunities will still be there, I said. But they'll be on my terms, built according to my values, designed to last rather than to impress. Grandmother's money gives me something more valuable than any investor could. Complete independence. What about working with Blackwell Industries? My father asked, and I could hear the careful hope in his voice. That depends entirely on whether you meant what you said last night about learning to respect my expertise without trying to manage my decisions. We meant it, Isabella said quickly. Then here's my proposal. Blackwell Industries can be our first major client. You'll pay market rates for our cybersecurity services, and you'll implement our recommendations without modification or second-guessing. It will be a legitimate business relationship between equals. not a family favor. I could almost hear them processing the implications. They would benefit from my expertise, but only by acknowledging it professionally and paying for it appropriately. And personally? Harrison asked quietly. Personally, we start over. New rules, new expectations, new respect for who we actually are rather than who we thought we should be. I'm willing to try, but only if you're willing to prove that last night's promises weren't just panic-driven damage control. The months that followed tested those promises in ways none of us anticipated. When I was featured on the cover of Fortune magazine as the entrepreneur who chose independence over billions, my parents didn't just display the magazine prominently. In their home, they learned enough about my work to discuss it intelligently at social gatherings. Isabella even joined a technology literacy group to better understand the industry that had once embarrassed her. When Whitman Cybersecurity Solutions prevented a major cyber attack on Boston's transit system, making front-page news across New England, Harrison didn't minimize my role or deflect attention. Instead, he organized a family celebration and invited his medical colleagues to learn about cybersecurity's role in protecting hospital systems. When the Department of Homeland Security awarded us the largest cybersecurity contract in Massachusetts history, my father didn't suggest ways I could leverage the success into something more substantial. He simply said he was proud of me, without qualifications or suggestions for improvement. The transformation wasn't perfect or immediate. There were moments when old patterns emerged, when someone would slip into treating my professional judgment as a family discussion topic rather than expert opinion. But each time we caught ourselves, apologized, and did better. Most importantly, I discovered something I hadn't expected. Once I stopped needing their approval, I became free to appreciate the unique strengths each of them brought to our family. Dynamic. Harrison's medical expertise provided valuable insights for healthcare cybersecurity applications. Isabella's social connections opened doors to nonprofit organizations that needed affordable digital protection. Even my father's business experience proved helpful when navigating complex government contracting requirements. 2 years later, Whitman Cybersecurity Solutions employs 43 people, protects critical infrastructure across 6 states, and has become the gold standard for ethical technology consulting. We've never compromised our principles for profit, never sacrificed employee welfare for growth targets, and never forgotten that our purpose is to protect people rather than to impress investors. But perhaps most significantly, I learned that the best revenge isn't proving people wrong, it's becoming so secure in your own worth that their opinion becomes irrelevant. My family's approval, which I'd spent years desperately seeking, eventually came naturally once I stopped needing it. The real victory wasn't the money or the recognition or even the successful business. It was walking into every room knowing exactly who I was and what I was worth, regardless of whether anyone else understood or appreciated it. Sometimes, the best way to win is to stop playing the game by other people's rules and start writing your own. 5 years after that fateful dinner, I stood in the ballroom of the Willowbrook Heights Grand Hotel, watching my parents mingle effortlessly with a crowd that would have been unimaginable to them just a few years earlier. Tech entrepreneurs, government officials, cybersecurity researchers, and Fortune 500 executives all gathered for the annual Whitman Foundation Gala, an event that had become one of the most prestigious technology conferences on the East Coast. The transformation was remarkable, but not in the way I'd originally expected. Sophia, Dr. Rebecca Chen from MIT approached with a warm smile. I just finished talking with your mother about the scholarship program. Her insights about identifying underrepresented students were brilliant. Where did she develop such expertise in educational equity? I glanced across the room at Isabella, who was deep in conversation with a group of high school students from inner-city Boston, recipients of the Margaret Blackwell Memorial Scholarships for students pursuing careers in technology despite family skepticism. She learned by listening, I said simply. Really listening, for the first time in her life. The scholarship program had been Isabella's idea, born from her recognition of how many young people faced the same dismissal I'd experienced. She'd spent 3 years volunteering with underprivileged students, learning about their challenges, and developing what had become the most successful tech diversity program in New England. Your father's presentation on medical device security was exceptional too, Dr. Chen continued. Has he always been so knowledgeable about cybersecurity applications? I smiled, watching Richard command a room full of hospital administrators, explaining how Blackwell Industries had become the first medical device manufacturer to achieve perfect cybersecurity ratings across all product lines. He's a quick learner when he's motivated. The integration of Whitman's security protocols into Blackwell's manufacturing had transformed both companies. But more than that, it had transformed my father. Working as equals had taught him to value expertise over hierarchy, innovation over tradition. He'd become genuinely passionate about the technology he'd once dismissed, not because it was profitable, though it certainly was, but because he finally understood its importance. A gentle hand touched my shoulder, and I turned to find Harrison, approaching with a young woman I didn't recognize. Sophia, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Kim, the new head of cybersecurity at Children's Hospital. Sarah, this is my sister, the one I've been telling you about. The introduction was so natural, so filled with genuine pride, that it took me a moment to remember how different things used to be. Harrison had become my most effective advocate in the medical community, translating cybersecurity concepts for healthcare professionals and championing the integration of security protocols into patient care systems. Dr. Blackwell, it's an honor, Dr. Kim said. Your brother speaks about your work constantly. The pediatric monitoring system security protocols you developed have revolutionized how we protect our most vulnerable patients. After Dr. Kim moved on, Harrison lingered beside me. Do you remember what I said that night? About you being still figuring things out? I nodded. I think about that regularly, he continued. Not with guilt anymore, but with amazement. You weren't figuring out what to do with your life. You were figuring out how to change the world. The rest of us were just too limited in our vision to see it. The evening's keynote speaker was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the current Secretary of Homeland Security, who had flown in specifically to announce the expansion of our federal cybersecurity contracts. As she spoke about the critical role of ethical technology companies in protecting national infrastructure, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not in being recognized, but in seeing the values we'd built Whitman around being validated at the highest levels of government. Before I conclude, Secretary Rodriguez said, I want to acknowledge someone whose grandmother would be extraordinarily proud tonight. Dr. Sophia Blackwell and Whitman Cybersecurity Solutions have proven that you can build a globally significant company without compromising your principles, that you can achieve extraordinary success while lifting others up, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to accept other people's limitations on your potential. The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most was seeing my family's faces in the crowd. Not proud because my success reflected well on them, but proud because they finally understood what I was actually accomplishing. Later, as the evening wound down, I found myself on the hotel's terrace with my parents and Harrison, looking out over the city lights of Boston. Your grandmother would have loved this, Isabella said softly. Not just the success, but seeing how it brought our family together in a way we never managed before. She knew it would, I replied. That's why she structured the trust the way she did. She wasn't just funding my company, she was investing in the possibility that we could learn to see each other clearly. Richard cleared his throat, a gesture that no longer signaled an incoming lecture, but rather his attempt to express something important. Sophia, I've never asked you this directly, but do you ever regret not taking the acquisition offer? $450 million. I considered the question seriously. Whitman Cybersecurity Solutions was now worth considerably more than that original offer. But more importantly, it represented something money couldn't buy. A company built entirely according to my values, employing people who shared my vision, protecting organizations that needed security but couldn't afford traditional solutions. No, I said finally. That money would have been someone else's bet on my technology. This is my bet on my values. And I've learned that when you bet on your values and win, the victory means something different. Harrison leaned against the terrace railing. What do you mean? When you succeed by other people's standards, you're always wondering if you're good enough for their approval. When you succeed by your own standards, you know exactly what you're worth. A comfortable silence settled over us as we watched the city below. A city where a family had learned to truly see each other, where a young woman had built something extraordinary by refusing to accept limitations, and where a grandmother's faith in her granddaughter's potential had ultimately transformed everyone it touched. So what's next? Isabella asked. More government contracts? International expansion? I smiled, thinking about the proposal I'd received just that morning, an invitation to establish a cybersecurity research institute that would train the next generation of ethical technology leaders. What's next, I said, is making sure that other young people don't have to choose between following their passion and having their family's support. What's next is building something that outlasts all of us. As we headed back inside, I caught my reflection in the hotel's glass doors. A woman who had learned that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to shrink yourself to fit other people's understanding of who you should be. The girl who had once desperately sought her family's approval had become a woman who created her own definitions of success. And in doing so, she had given her family the gift of learning to do the same. Sometimes, the greatest revolution is simply becoming yourself, fully and unapologetically, and trusting that the right people will eventually learn to see your worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.